let's go to the context of Kenya.
Sure.
And Zahed. Tell us about what's going on there. My understanding is that extremists have leveraged social media to sort of create tribal division and violence, in particular around the 2017 presidential election.
Yeah, just to step back slightly, I mean, as an organization that's concerned with the rise of extremism, we've been primarily focused on non-state actors and how they leverage online tools to recruit and radicalize. In the last few years, we've seen a coordination between state and non-state actors in elections in Western countries, and we published many reports on elections in Europe, Italy, Germany. We have one coming out in Swedish elections, actually, shortly. But in Kenya, a couple of years ago, we decided to try to get ahead of the curve and to see how the online space was being exploited to destabilize the country, particularly in elections. I mean, it's a unique country in terms of sub-Saharan Africa. It's quite well developed, has a high internet penetration, and is sort of ripe for the disruption that we've seen in other parts of the world. But of course, the consequences are far greater. So we looked at the online.
Why are they far greater?
Well, because the reach is growing so rapidly, and the responses can't keep up with the ever-expanding reach. So that growth is so quick that, for example, the social media companies themselves, the open platforms, Facebook, Google, and so forth, when we started our work, they were just setting up policy teams in East Africa. So in terms of how their platforms were exploited in that context, they may not have had the tools or the resources to address the issues. And so we work closely with them anyway. So we wanted to be part of that solution, bring them in as a partner, and analyze how those platforms are being exploited. So we conducted, I can tell you more about the work we did there to find out what the situation was. We conducted a study to find out actually how extremists were exploiting those platforms. And we found they were openly recruiting on pages that were openly supporting Al-Shabaab, ISIS, and other groups, but also that as elections were coming, groups that had tribal interests in promoting division along tribal lines. And remember, these types of divisions have led to violence in the past. In Kenyan elections, over 1,000 people died 10 years ago in elections. So we were very concerned about how the elections could exploit those divisions even further and serve as a proxy for electoral violence through tribalism. So and the other issue is that we tend to sort of look at the disinformation from an English language perspective. What was missing in the Kenyan context is a lot was happening in Swahili. And when you look at languages like that, you have far fewer subject matter experts, far fewer data sources to understand exactly what is happening in that language. So a lot of the recruitment that we saw from extremist groups was happening deliberately in languages that were difficult to detect for either Western NGOs or Western companies. So we found quite a volatile landscape. And this was not just us as an NGO. We worked with Kenyan partners, dozens of them, to analyze and actually make the connection between what was happening online with the ramifications offline. So our partners in Kenya saw the offline effects. We were able to connect the dots with what was happening online to produce those effects, primarily young Kenyans joining extremist groups in Somalia, but also participating in recruitment within Kenya itself. So that sort of set the groundwork for a response, and I can talk about that in the next.
Okay, so election context, obviously very important, but utilizing tribal narratives.
Exploiting, yes, exactly. Natural divisions. And Kenya has, it's evenly divided between Christian and Muslim, between Swahili and English speakers. So there's a lot of potential fault lines for division to exploit. Even the political parties are largely separated on tribal lines.
Yes. Let me ask one more question. You talked about state and non-state actor interplay. How about foreign and domestic?
Yeah.
And in particular, reporting about the role of Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sort of getting ahead a little bit, but what we ended up doing was working with NGOs in Kenya to produce messaging along four thematic areas that they felt, and actually from the research that we showed, were issues that were being exploited by not just by extremists, but by politicians as the election period came, which were electoral violence, extremism, tribal divisions, and religious intolerance. And we brought in partners, Facebook, Google, Twitter, all contributing resources, significant resources for these organizations to produce messaging along those lines. We were very clear that we did not want them to be political. We were just trying to mitigate the effects that happen through the political process, the negative social effects. So because of that, we were able to produce, our partners were able to produce independently dozens of campaigns that we released on an ongoing basis through the election period in Kenya, which actually became an extended period because the original elections were nullified by the Supreme Court. So they reached every single Facebook user in Kenya. And at the time we did that, our partners in Kenya were telling us about ads that were being produced unattributed on behalf of the incumbent president, which were actually going against some of the campaigns that our partners were doing, exploiting extremism, exploiting tribal divisions, and so forth. And it turned out, we found out earlier this year, that those were produced by Cambridge Analytica. So we were literally, our partners were producing messaging in opposition to what Cambridge Analytica was doing in Kenya on behalf of the president. So it became a real indication of how easy it is for a foreign entity to sort of manipulate the discourse. I mean, I know the irony that we are an NGO that's working in Kenya with Kenyan partners, but we were actually very transparent. We had a press conference in Nairobi afterwards and told everyone exactly what we did and what we didn't do. Cambridge Analyticas don't do that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you're using the digital platforms
yeah.
also.
Absolutely.
As counter.
Exactly, and it's the messaging itself. Again, it's not casting aspersions on political lines. It's literally trying to produce messaging that encourages the voting population not to engage in electoral violence, not to engage in tribalism, not to engage in promoting any kind of extremism. Yeah. So those things nobody could argue against, even the Kenyan government.
So we'll get into that. The dual nature of the technology. It's still good, bad, and we need the good guys to dominate. Yeah. Okay, so let's go right there to your work on counter-narrative.
Yeah, just along the same lines. I mean, one of the strategies that we've researched over the years that we found can be effective if done well is that, I mean, the response to disinformation really needs to be decentralized, and for that to happen, it really needs to be a civil society-driven approach. That's exactly the reason why we started with talking to civil society organizations in Kenya about their experiences and their capacity and how they felt they could respond, and informing the process, not controlling it, but providing resources and guidance and research for them to make the right decisions on how to effectively craft messages. At the end of the day, this is a battle for hearts and minds. Disinformation simply is an attempt to, shift that in a particular direction. And for the members of society who have a stake in how prosperous and how stable that society is, they're the ones who can really drive the messaging about what their ideals are, what their vision is for their society. So in these messages that we had, these campaigns that we had our partners make, we wanted to make sure that they were obviously changing hearts and minds. First was the reach, making sure that everyone was able to see. And actually, it costs surprisingly little, for example, to promote a campaign across every Facebook user in Kenya. There's only about 4.5 million at the moment. It's growing rapidly, but it was in the sort of $10,000 range. You could literally reach every Facebook user. That's what Cambridge Analytica did as well. But more importantly is, how do you demonstrate that those messages are actually changing hearts and minds for the better? And so we conducted a broken link survey of 25,000 online users in Kenya around 4 representative examples of these thematic campaigns, and measured up to 50% positive attitudinal shift compared with a control group. So, which was really encouraging for us. I mean, it's hard to be that targeted in a developing country when it comes to making sure the right audience sees the right message, which is key in terms of messaging. You really want that. But by separating it into thematic areas and putting it around the election when everyone was active around all of this across the country, our aim became mass reach, and then hoping that the right people saw the right message because of that mass reach. And then, of course, measuring that attitudinal shift meant that we were definitely on the right track. I mean, anecdotally, we can say that far, far fewer people were dying as a result of electoral violence, even though it was a very volatile. I mean, when I gave my press conference in Nairobi, the opposition leader was crowning himself president in a park across the street, and yet, things actually didn't, get out of hand. So I think there is, and once civil society has the tools to do this, they can learn from it and keep going. It's really not that hard.
So let me ask a challenging question. I really like this idea of civil society-led approach to the solution. I love that. However, I think there's another dimension of civil society-led that's not only about counter-narratives and winning hearts and minds, but more about civic education, media literacy, and simply getting the consumers of digital information to be more savvy and skeptical and internalize a sense they don't want to be duped.
That is half the battle right there. It's more, we actually do engage in a lot of digital literacy programs in Europe, with partners like Google, for example. And in a place like Kenya, that's one of the first things we encourage our social media partners to do is to get involved in digital literacy efforts in those countries. I mean, those are really resource intensive. I mean, you have, a massive population to reach of varying degrees of literacy. It's quite an endeavor, but it is critically important because even our messages will not resonate unless people know how to distinguish them from disinformation.
That's right. So I know that it's time consuming, it's labor intensive, it's costly, but it's needed. It's needed. It's underdeveloped. I think people don't appreciate the potency if we do it well.
And feeding it into the existing educational framework is probably the best way to do that. So you have to work. This is where you have to work closely with governments and try to get them on side to treat digital literacy as a key component of their educational policy.
All right, let's turn now to...
Just building on what Ty and Pankaj have mentioned, I mean, this isn't so much a technological or political phenomenon as a cultural phenomenon. And it may be a generation before things stabilize. We don't know. In the meantime, we each have to look at our strengths, whether they're a particular sector or particular organizations, and do what we can to help push in the right direction. For us, as an organization that's dealing mostly with the rise of extremism, our role, we feel, is to help mitigate the negative consequences of all of this as it relates to on the ground, particularly with people resorting to violence. That's what we would do. I think if we all work together in our respective areas of expertise and coordinate more effectively, I mean, there's a lot of dialogue. I mean, this is a great example of getting a lot of different partners in the room who are dealing with different aspects of this phenomenon. Getting us to work and coordinate together more carefully, I think we can push forward in a positive direction.
Great. Maria, thanks so much. I hope this panel has given you a sense of the variability across the globe and yet also conveyed on some level we are absolutely all in this together, and all stakeholders, government, certainly civil society, private sector actors need to be working together to solve this threat. So let's give a thanks to our panel.